Alright, I'm sure we've all seen different discussions about DoT falling off, being a dead damage niche, and there being a ton of different reasons for that. Like, maybe it's the lack of dedicated supports, or not having a healer built for the niche, or maybe it's just the stat increases that mobs like Hule have gotten, where his crazy speed makes all the dots wear off super quickly. Those are all perfectly valid reasons, but what I think they all miss is something a lot more simple. Most of those issues aren't really a problem with DoT itself. In my opinion, it's actually more of a fundamental issue of the path that's attached to it, and how Hoyo handles paths in general. So let's talk about why that is. Around the first few patches of the game, it felt like every path had a specialized role, and to an extent, I think that's mostly stayed the same. For example, Hunt is still mostly single target damage dealers, Erudition characters usually have a fully AoE ability, and Abundance characters can heal. On the other hand, I don't think Nihility ever really had that kind of specialized role, nor is it meant to be a DoT specific class, and as a result we're in the situation we are now where it feels like one path is fighting between two different archetypes, and that's what's causing a lot of unrest about the DoT niche and there being a bunch of people wanting it to be improved. Remember for a second here, when the game launched we actually only had one DoT character, which was Sampo. The only other two Nihility characters at the time were Pella and Welt, who are more so debuffers than they are units that deal any kind of damage over time. The next post-launch Nihility unit after them was Silverwolf, who's also a debuffer, and that made it feel like they were establishing a trend that the Nihility path was going to be meant for debuffers. But it didn't stay that way. It may have started as a debuffer class, but then it transitioned into a DoT class when they were selling Kafka, Gui, and Black Swan. It then switched away from that into a damage dealer with Acheron, and then back to a debuffer with Zhao Q. If you're into Foxtails, you know that these inconsistencies are just going to continue. In my opinion, those inconsistencies in how the path has developed over the lifetime of the game has brought a few problems with it. For one, the entire Nihility path just feels way too broad, or in other words, it feels like the entire path is just missing an identity. Honestly, I really can't say that's a fault of the characters or the damage types that are inside of it. It's just that when you have an entire class that's generically about debuffs, it's really hard to make specialized units inside of it for every different type of debuff. So here's a random factoid. There are currently 52 non-duplicate debuffs in the game. Of those 52, only 12 of them actually deal damage. The rest are all just there to amplify different kinds of damage in some way, or they have some aspect of control over characters and enemies like slows, action delays, or bans on abilities. This results in me feeling like DoT was a damage mechanic slapped onto a role that it doesn't necessarily belong with. Like, sure, applying a DoT is technically a debuff on the enemy, but its purpose is to deal damage, which puts it into an entirely different category altogether. Considering the amount of non-damaging debuffs, DoT basically feels like it doesn't belong in comparison. Basically, my thought process is that I don't think Hoyo is really ever going to be able to focus on DoT specifically because they have to essentially take care of the entire Nihility path. There's only so many characters that they can release per patch, and with it being such a broad niche, it could take years before we get any kind of fix for the issues that DoT has. In the future, whenever Hoyo makes a Nihility character, they're always going to have to weigh whether they want to make them work as a damage dealer or support under the DoT archetype, or a debuffer outside of that archetype. As an example, Zhao Q could have been that. He leans towards the DoT niche with his Ashen Roast debuff applying burn, but instead of doubling down on that niche to make him something like a 5-star Gui, they decided to make the damage that his DoT deals pretty weak and apply ult damage vulnerability instead of DoT vulnerability. They even took it further by locking his DoT dealing any kind of real damage behind his E2, which is an insane investment for anyone that just wanted to get a basic support for the DoT niche. As a result, he ended up feeling like he was exclusively designed for Acheron instead of something like DoT. In the future, I really only see this kind of thing continuing. For example, if the next 5-star DPS that we get wants enemies to be applied with freeze, the next Nihility unit might have to do that instead of anything DoT related. That would once again leave DoT by the wayside until the next potential Nihility unit is released after them. Another issue that I see with this is that apparently characters don't even need to be a part of the Nihility role to apply debuffs, like Moze with his 2 different debuffs that increase follow-up damage, or Gallagher with his Besotted debuff to increase break damage. This further dilutes the field of potential helpers to DoT, because if you've got a Hunt unit applying a damage bonus while also doing a bunch of damage, why would you ever use a Nihility unit to fill that same slot? Having units outside of the Nihility niche applying debuffs just further lowers the likelihood that we'll get an actual DoT unit. So honestly, it feels like Hoyo is kind of just messed up at this point. The whole path feels like a catch-all generic class that covers way too many different areas of the game, and as a result doesn't end up having any real specialized purpose. They have to compete with other units in their own archetype, Harmony units that are generally offering bigger buffs for the team, and even units from other paths entirely that are meant to deal damage, as I mentioned earlier. To Hoyo's slight credit, maybe the reason that these units outside of the Nihility Path are gaining access to debuffs is so that they can eventually go back and make the path more focused on DoT to bring it back into relevance. Personally though, I feel like that only goes back to what I mentioned earlier, and that's consistency, or I guess the lack thereof. When a path seems to change its purpose every single time a new unit is released, honestly it just kinda ends up confusing, and I don't think that's a good thing for player expectations. Moving past just talking about the different debuffs, something else I think worth mentioning here is that I feel the biggest thing holding DoT back is actually just Kafka. The entire niche feels like it's being held back by relying on a unit released in 1.2 to actually function. Like, imagine how we'd feel in 4.x if the Harmony Trailblazer was still the only unit that could enable Super Break. It wouldn't exactly feel amazing because the game will simply scale past what they can offer as an individual unit by that time. That said, I don't necessarily think that a new Kafka would solve all of DoT's problems, because I feel like in a vacuum, DoT is fine. Releasing a character that lets DoT do something crazy like crit, or introducing a super DoT mechanic would cause just as many problems as Super Break has. As it is, I think it deals okay damage, and while it's definitely not at the top of the meta, people can still get value out of it, but that doesn't change that it definitely feels neglected. So I feel that what DoT really needs is just focus for a few patches from Hoyo. The Nihility Path being so diluted and acting as a generic catch-all doesn't do it any favors in terms of staying relevant, or depending on how pessimistic you are, becoming relevant in the first place. At this point, I feel the only real solution to DoT's problems is if they separated that damage mechanic into an entirely different path. Sure, we might still get units of that type slowly, but it would be a lot harder to ignore an entire path built around one mechanic than a path that's super generic like the current iteration of Nihility. Realistically though, I don't see Hoyo ever moving characters out of a path, so I guess let's talk about potential options they have if they want to improve it. For one, while I don't see them moving characters into a different path, I do see a possibility of them introducing a new path for a specialized role in the game. So, since the Nihility path is so diluted as it is, why not add a new path that would take over the debuffer role, thus letting Nihility move back towards that DoT niche? Even if they don't do that, at the very least I feel like what the niche needs is focus, like I mentioned earlier. They don't necessarily need a DoT healer or even a DoT specific support. I think what they really need is variety. Since this game has launched, we've gotten 37 new units, and only 4 of those units are related to DoT damage. Sorry, I really don't count Jiaoqiu there. On top of that, all of them are using debuffs that strictly deal damage instead of anything more unique or fun. Or in other words, the niche generally lacks damage variety. Instead of a support like Robin or Ranmei but for DoT, I feel what Hoyo really needs to do is use the damage these characters deal as a means of support. After all, it's called damage over time. We could have a Quantum Nihility unit that applies a stacking quantum damage debuff that increases damage taken by the enemy from other DoTs. We could have an Imaginary unit that has damage ticks that apply a stacking percentage-based slow. Maybe there could be a Wind unit that makes DoT damage move separately in the turn order whenever its DoTs activate to trigger them without making the enemy take a turn. I think there's a lot of unexplored routes they can go down just focused on damage that they haven't even taken a look at yet, and in my opinion, all of that should come before they look at any kind of support or healer specifically built for the niche. Making a broken healer or support for the niche would definitely be an easy way to fix it, similar to how Robin brought follow-ups into relevance, but I can't say that would be super creative or make it more fun. There's tons of hyper carries, there's tons of follow-up units, hell, there's even tons of break units despite it being a much newer archetype, yet only 4 Nihility units actually focused on DoT. Adding in variety to the damage archetype while focusing on what makes it satisfying to play would go a long way to keep it more interesting overall. Alongside that, I will always be a fan of buffs to older characters, so if they really wanted to, I think going down the route of increasing the multipliers on DoT units to bring them more up to par with current age units wouldn't be a terrible idea. At the end of the day, I think if they were just at a level playing field with the other damage archetypes, it would be an easy avenue for it to be relevant again. What do you think? What options does Hoyo have to bring DoTs back into relevance? Is it really just a support difference, or do you think there's other avenues to explore before introducing a broken unit to fix the niche's problems? Feel free to let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. Thank you very much for watching. Join my Discord link down below, and maybe give my other videos a shot too.